Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. Okay, tonight we don't have the teleprompter. I'm going to have to read to you off the computer screen. Bear with my eyes being riveted in absolutely the wrong place. Okay, even monsters occasionally do something of value. Donald Trump, a man who has cruelty where his heart should be, has done something good. He has helped negotiate a peace between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. That peace settlement joins earlier peace agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan. Why is this peace deal important? Because it may, just may, help cool the hatred of Arabs against Israel's Jews, a hatred that looks like it would last forever. Here's the story. When Israel was established in 1948, 5 Arab states had their radio stations, broadcast messages to the Arabs living in Israel, telling them to leave immediately. Why? Because 5 Arab armies were about to invade with battalions of tanks, and to use the phrase of the time, those armies were about to drive the Jews into the sea. This genocide, said the broadcast, would take 24 hours or less. When it was over, the Arab inhabitants could return, and in keeping with their Chapter 8 of the Quran, the chapter on the distribution of war booty, those Arabs would be able to make themselves rich with the spoils, rich with the property the Jews had left behind, plus any Jewish women or teenage girls still alive would be theirs for the raping. Yes, Chapter 8 of the Quran lays down the rules for divvying up the clothes, farms, gold, and captured women. It lays down the rules for the rape of captured women. And it lays down the rules for divvying up the sex slaves. Things did not work out the way the broadcasters had promised, and they did not work out the way the 5 attacking Arab governments had wished. The Jews of Israel fought to defend themselves. The war lasted 10 months, and the Jews won. What happened to the roughly 650,000 Arabs who left Israel in the hope of coming back the next day and wallowing in abandoned goods? Like roughly 16 million other displaced people in the 1940s, in the wake of World War II, these Arabs became war refugees. But they were not treated the way other war refugees of the period were treated. All of the war refugees of Europe were repatriated. They were taken in and given homes, including 14.6 million Germans and people of German descent in Eastern Europe, in Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland, who were forced to flee back to Germany. How did Germany treat these displaced peoples, these brethren? The Germans took these 14.6 million refugees in. This is not what happened with the Arab refugees created by the war to exterminate Israel. The Arab nations were not interested in settling these brethren, these refugees, and giving them homes, despite the fact that the Arabs of the Middle East possess a territory 3 times the size of the United States, despite the fact that much of that Arab territory is empty, and despite the fact that the Jews of Israel were eager to teach the Arabs how to do what the Jews had done with the barren and inhospitable land of Israel. The Jews were eager to teach the Arabs how to turn malarial swamps and parched deserts into rich fields and orchards, into greenery and gardens and grain. But greenery and gardens and grain were not the Arab national obsession. What was? Jewish genocide, killing all the Jews of Israel. Why? Because the words of the Quran and the Hadith, the words of the holy sayings of Muhammad, demand a killer culture. They demand that good Muslims take over any territory that is not ruled by Islam. They demand that Muslims follow the example of Muhammad, who conquered 317 square miles a day for 10 years in a row. And the Quran and the Hadith say very special things about Jews. Explain the Hadith in 4 separate places. The day of judgment shall not come until every stone and tree stands up and says, "There is a Jew behind me. Kill him." And adds the Quran, for their resistance to Islam, for their so-called worshipping evil, the Jews shall be turned into pigs and monkeys. In the spirit of the Quran and the Hadith, the Arab nations of the Middle East were intent on exterminating Israel, and they remained intent on that extermination, even after losing their 1948 war. So the Arab nations did something special for the Muslim refugees from Israel that their war had produced. They created an ethnic identity that had never existed before. They called the new mass of refugees Palestinians. Where did that name, Palestinians, come from? In 63 BC, Roman imperialists conquered Israel. But the Jews of Israel rebelled against the Romans 3 times, starting in 66 AD. In 70 AD, the Romans grew tired of one Jewish rebellion after another. So they sent their soldiers into Israel to utterly stamp out resistance. They leveled the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the Jews' only holy site, their temple. They raped the Jews. They enslaved them. And they sent untold numbers into exile. And to humiliate the Jews, the Romans gave the land of Israel the name of the Jews' greatest biblical enemy, the Philistines. To humiliate the Jews, the Romans renamed Israel and Syria Palestine. In 1917, another group of imperialists, the British, issued the Balfour Declaration, a declaration that divided the former Roman province of Palestine in 2 and gave 1/2 to those who had inhabited it for 3,200 years, the Jews, the indigenous people of Israel. They gave the other half to another group of imperialist, colonialist conquerors, imperialists who had invaded Israel in 637 AD and had let it become a nearly unusable wasteland. Those new imperialists were the Muslims. They were the Arabs. After the Balfour Declaration promised to divide this so-called Palestine in half in 1917, the Arabs were allowed to do something sneaky with their half. They were allowed to rename it Transjordan. They were allowed to claim it had been theirs all along. And they were allowed to say that the Balfour Declaration really meant that the half of Palestine they left behind was what was supposed to be divided in half. Yes, they took half, they hid it under a new name, and they claimed that what remained was what was supposed to be divided, meaning once the new arithmetic was done, that the Jews were screwed. Instead of their promised half of Palestine, they got a quarter. In fact, the Jews got a slice of Palestine so thin that it was only 9 miles wide at its slenderest point. To put it another way, the Jews got a slice so small that it was 1/19th the size of California, meaning that the 1/4 of Palestine that the Jews received was militarily almost indefensible. And the Arabs got 3/4 of Palestine. 3/4. Or to put it differently, there has been a two-state solution ever since 1921. Ever since 1921, the Arabs have had 75% of Palestine. But that Arab 75% of Palestine is now called Jordan. So when you hear of the 1948 borders of Israel, you have to realize that when it comes to the territory that the Romans called Palestine, Arabs already possess 75%. And the Jews have been, to repeat, screwed, flummoxed, flim-flammed. They only got half of what they'd been promised. Here's where the refugees of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War get into this charade. These Arab refugees were penned up in refugee camps. And the Arabs claimed that these refugees had a unique national identity. The Arabs said the refugees were Palestinians. But until 1964, when this farce went into full swing, there was no such thing as a Palestinian. In fact, until World War I, these Arabs had been part of a borderless Islamic caliphate ruled from Turkey. There had been no such thing as a nation of Palestine, and no such thing as a Palestinian people. And in fact, in 1948, there was now a substantial territory in which the refugees should have found a home. There was an Arab Palestine. There was already a Palestinian state. To repeat, it was now called Jordan. And it dwarfed Israel in size. You could fit 6.5 Israels into just one Jordan. Despite that, the Arab world successfully manufactured the myth that Jordan was not a slice of Palestine. And the Arab refugees who had been told to leave Israel so they could go back the next day and take all the goodies, including the girls and women, were not repatriated in the Palestinian lands of Jordan, the way the Polish Germans were repatriated in Germany. Instead, most of them were penned in permanent refugee camps along the borders of Israel. And the Arabs said that this monstrous imprisonment, as an imprisonment that the Arabs themselves had perpetrated, was the fault of the Jews. The Arabs also claimed that there had been a long-existing Arab peoplehood, a nation called Palestine. Again, this was not true. But over the course of the next 60 years, the Arabs and their Western cheerleaders would manage to trace this so-called nation all the way back to the Canaanites in the Bible. Again, all of this was manufactured history. All of this was false. However, gullible Westerners who knew nothing about the history of Islamic imperialism and colonialism swallowed the dishonest story whole. Why did the Arabs piece together this con? Because their goal remained what it had been in 1948, to exterminate the Jews. Oh, and one more thing, to wipe the state of Israel off the map. The Arabs' real goal remained what it had been in 1948, genocide. And the so-called Palestinians, the permanent refugees, were used as a tool, a crowbar, a propaganda platform, and a terrorist army to weaken the Jewish state. This is why the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates is important. The Arabs are now faced with a real existential threat. The Arabs are faced with a threat from Iran. The man who founded the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979, the man who founded modern Iran, was the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. An Ayatollah is an Islamic super scholar, a scholar who studies, among other things, Muhammad's demand that Islam conquer the entire world for the God who made this world, Allah. And the Ayatollah dictated that every state not ruled by pure Islamic thought must be toppled and conquered pitilessly, whether that state was a nation of unbelievers like the United States or a nation of fellow Muslims like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab Emirates. The only pure Islam was, of course, the Ayatollah's form of Islam. So as the Ayatollah put it, when it came to any version of Islam but the Ayatollah's, this corruption must be swept away and its instigators punished for their deeds. We have, says the Ayatollah, in reality, then, no choice but to destroy those systems of government. And in fact, the early Iranian state targeted the governments of Iraq, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia to be swept away. To Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, this means the extermination not just of their ruling families, and not just of their political elites, but the eradication of everything they believe to be real Islam. Why? The Iranians' version of Islam is what the Arab nations regard as a demonic heresy. It's Shiite Islam. The Arab nations are Sunni Muslims. To the Arab leaders, the imposition of Shia beliefs